Welcome to Gracefully Graying. I'm your host, Attorney Henry Gornvine. Please go to the Henry Gornvine Gracefully Graying YouTube channel to see all of the other shows with regard to Gracefully Graying. Also go to the new website, gracefullygraying.com. Today in Gracefully Graying, I'm pleased to welcome Sabrina Cronin, head of the Cronin Law Firm, as we discuss an issue that is becoming more and more prevalent called the great divorce. Sabrina, welcome to Gracefully Graying.
Thank you so much.
First of all, what do we mean when we talk about a great divorce?
Well, it's actually just typically for people who are in older years and getting a divorce. It's a term that you coined, frankly, and it's really just for people in their later years.
And why is this different than other divorces? Other divorces, you have issues, children, custody, property division, spousal support, child support. Why would a great divorce be different than a typical divorce?
Well, it's different in the aspect of dealing mostly with their financial health. And when you're divorcing in an older age, you are faced with, how do I live? How am I going to maintain my lifestyle? If you're having to look at divorce, having been married your entire life and you were a stay-at-home mom, well, how is that person going to sustain the level of lifestyle to which she was accustomed? Or likewise for the husband. He may or may not have to give up half of his interest in his business that he's worked his entire life for. There's the old saying, it's cheaper to keep her. Well, sometimes it is. Right. And that aspect, it's also hard. You're facing your own mortality. So, what you thought once was really isn't. And you have to create this whole new life for yourself, this whole new chapter. If you have children or grandchildren, it's going to be an adjustment for them as well, because, vacations will be different, the family circumstance and dynamic will be different. So there's a whole new element of emotional difficulty attached to it when you're trying to, dissipate and divorce from something that you've known really your entire adult life.
Sabrina, often what happens is the children will grow up, they're off to college or in the workforce, and hopefully they're out of the house. More and more now we have situations where children go to college and they come back home and we're back. And so the issue is, when the children, it's an empty nest.
Yes.
And is this often a reason for a great divorce?
Well, as you know, people are very busy tending to their children. So during those, middle-aged years when your children are younger and you're tending to their activities or their school and you're working, whether you're a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad or you have a busy career or both parties are working, your lives are busy and you get caught up in everything, whether it's your children's friends, parents, and you have this whole network of people and community. Well, as soon as your children go off to college, it's not just an empty home or empty nest, if you will. It's really more of an empty life. You don't have all of their activities or their friends, their families, the parties or the activities or the games or the social events relating to their sporting activities or whatever it is. So then the two parties are faced with having to recreate the dynamic of their relationship to create that intimacy again. Because if you don't have that communication during those years, and it's easy, if you're not working on it every day or even every week, it's easy to fall back in patterns where you don't talk to one another, you don't share commonalities, you don't discuss things, you don't get to that level of intimacy that two people need to sustain the depth of a relationship. And so when their children leave, they're often faced with looking at themselves and realizing, well, they don't have as much in common anymore. But instead of working at it, people now are so ready to flee or get divorced instead of really working at it. But then People are like, well, my life is so short. Again, they're looking at their own mortality.
Right.
And they say, I just want to be happy. I don't want to have to work in therapy for 2 years to create this love again. And so they bail.
You're right. Or else, I've seen situations, Sabrina, where people have come to me and they've said, kids are now gone. I'm getting close to retirement age. I want to travel, but my wife doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Or we have nothing in common. And again, unless you can find commonality, you're going to be staring at a screen or for many, many years and having not much there. So
Right. But that's years in the making, Henry. I mean,
You're
that's
right.
years in the making. And unless somebody, you have to be invested in the relationship to begin with. And unless you're invested on so many levels, then, you know, there isn't going to be sustainability. But it takes two people. It can't just be one person fighting for it. So unless they're both in it, then they might as well divorce.
which is hard.
It is hard, and no one should settle either. Say the husband really wants to stay and fight for it, but the wife doesn't, or vice versa. You know, you can't force somebody to want it like you do. And unless you're both on the same page, well, it's not going to work. And no one should settle for anything less than what they want or what they deserve. I mean, everybody deserves happiness. Everybody deserves a very rewarding relationship, someone that they feel compatible with and want to grow old with. Older with, you know, and
Old's valid.
you know, or travel or do whatever. You know, you have to have common interests and goals, or even if you don't, you have to respect the other person's goals and interests and partake in that so that the other person doesn't feel isolated or alone. And again, it's just all about communication and what you want out of your relationship.
I was going to say the key is communication, and
Yeah.
so many people, they don't communicate.
But what I've seen, you know, but it depends on that person's tolerance level too. You know, I've seen, as you have, people divorcing for something so minor to maybe another couple divorcing that they've withstood for years and years and years, right? I mean, someone's level of tolerance or their reasons for divorce can be very different from one another.
Oh, and you and I have seen just about every reason under the sun. And
Sure.
part of it is, I think you've got to learn to forgive, move on if there are issues, and look for ways to communicate and rebuild. And that's, again, a prime time for, if you're having issues, it's time for therapy.
Yeah.
But let's say they can't move on. So we have the gray divorce. And one issue, our economics are much more difficult.
Yes.
And why don't we discuss that a little? It's like, think of the fact, you're in your 30s or 40s, you get a divorce. Okay, you divide what you have. There are always minor children, or often minor children, and you move on and you rebuild. If there's spousal support, it's not going to be long-term. Child support is going to end when the children reach the age of maturity. So what are some of the differences with regard to the grade of divorce, especially if there's a long-term marriage or there's a second marriage?
Well, I was going to say, especially if it's a long-term marriage. I mean, some people get married, you know, later in life and only have a 5-year marriage or 10-year marriage. That's obviously not as difficult to separate as, you know, their finances, even in their elder years, as if someone who has been married for 30 or 40 years, or like you say, their second marriage for 20 years perhaps. You know, most oftentimes a great divorce, as you say, the children are grown, if there were any children. So it is all financial. And by that time in most people's lives, you have more of a retirement account. You have more assets to divide. And again, you may have a business together or several businesses together or a vacation home or 2 vacation homes. So it really comes down to splitting the assets and dividing the familial property like a business, you know, like
Right.
any kind of business separation. You're divorcing each other, but you're divorcing all of the financials as well. And so you have to take the emotion out of it and really look at the financial aspect of these two parties' lives. And if there's no prenuptial agreement, most oftentimes in second marriages there should be, because the rate of divorce in a second marriage
Sure,
is
it's higher.
much higher than a first. But you know, it's a little bit more involved when it comes to the economic side, because typically in older years you have more to split. or hope so.
Hope so, but then even when you have more to split, you know, if there's $1 million estate, you're each walking away with $500,000 hypothetically. So that could be enough for the rest of your life if you're in your 60s or late 50s.
Well, it depends on the lifestyle that you've been living that entire time. You know, obviously what someone might like or enjoy might not be what another person wants or enjoys. You know, I know a lot of people as they get older, they want to get rid of their things, their personal belongings, their property, and just kind of travel. I know some people who want the second home still, and they want a place where their grandchildren can go. So, you know, if you're used to living a high lifestyle, then no, $500,000 is not enough to live if you have 15, 20 years left of your life.
What about the fact, and to me this is a major factor, you don't have time to recoup. If you're in your 30s or 40s, you divide it, and you begin the rebuilding process, and there's time.
Right.
Late 50s, mid 60s, 70s, the time is more limited.
It is. And I think any attorney would be remiss if they did not explain to the client. And recently I had a client come to me. She was in her 70s, had been really unhappy for many years. Her husband was not kind and did, you know, not as respectful as he probably should have been. And they had no relationship, really, for all intents and purposes. They were living separate lives under one roof. And she really wanted a divorce. But I had to explain to her that, you know, there's only so much money to go around. And if she divorced her husband at that moment, her lifestyle would be dramatically different.
Sure.
And she doesn't want to deal with that. So she'd rather live the way she's living and have an emptier, you know, personal relationship with somebody, but yet have the security of the finances. So that's the choice that that person has to make. And it's a real, it could be a real problem if that person isn't really aware of what the ramifications of divorce could be.
And those are tough decisions because, you know, it's like what cost is freedom? What cost is trying to find happiness, especially if you're in a miserable marriage?
Right. And that's the problem. But if you don't have that choice, if your spouse, whether it's the wife or the husband, if that spouse makes that decision for you, and, you know, let's just say the shoe was reversed, the shoe was on the other foot, and her husband wanted to divorce her, in this particular example I just gave, well, she would have no choice but to then have to learn to live with a lesser, you know, income, because they don't have a joint account. You know, because she wasn't working. She was living off of her husband's income, but then he was retiring, and, you know, then there's Social Security, and, you know, when you're on a fixed income, it's a little bit more difficult. Then what do you do?
And that brings us to the next question, and that is, you have a case where husband, it could be the wife as well, but one of the spouses has been a major breadwinner, and the other one basically either had a lesser job or was a stay-at-home mom or stay-at-home dad raising the children. The marriage ends. How do you get back into the marketplace? How viable are you going to be? I mean, these are important issues.
Yeah, they're back in the marketplace in terms of dating again, or finances, or trying to make a living, or all of it.
Dating again, that's another issue, and it's an important issue, but I'm saying, you know.
You can't find a job at that age. I mean, a lot of employers don't hire seniors.
They don't want people in their 50s or 60s. It's harder. Part of the reason is they don't think they're aggressive enough, sharp enough, but they have skills that have been utilized over years. But if someone has been out of the job market for a 30-year marriage, they're not going to find much.
No. Perhaps a retail position somewhere, but to make an income, you know, a real income in retail, of course, as you know, you have to work hard, build up your clientele, you know, have the loyal, you know, customers coming in, but it's not easy at all.
It's tough.
It's very tough.
Especially in our society, which frankly favors people who are younger.
Absolutely, they do.
Someone in their 60s or 70s or even late 50s who's competing with someone in their 20s or 30s as far as, you know, a retail establishment. It's tough.
I mean, even home-based businesses, or, you know, e-commerce or any kind of online, business, if you want to create, it's not easy. And to learn those skills takes time, takes money, takes effort, and there's only so much time, that someone wants to have to invest.
Let's talk about another issue, and that is second marriage. You have issues, as you said earlier, there should be a prenuptial agreement. Sabrina, we both agree to that.
Yeah.
But that's not the rule, that's the exception. I
know.
hear so many people, well, I'm in love, it's going to work, and we don't need a prenup. Well, 2 years later, 5 years later, even 10 years later, problems. And then a lot of people, what they do, they may commingle assets, or there may be a home that is brought into the second marriage, and it's not commingled, and one person has a home, the other person doesn't. So there are a lot of issues there.
Yeah, for sure. For the second marriage, yeah.
Yes.
And then sometimes the issues could be too, the children involved, whether it's the children of one party or both parties, merging families, the blended families. Oftentimes that creates a lot of problems and tension, problems that probably should have been foreseen by the two parties, but when they claim that they're so in love or infatuated, in my opinion, it's more of an infatuation at that stage.
You're right.
The depth isn't there yet, and they don't take the time to really get to know one another, to really get to know their situations. They jump in, with both feet because they have those feelings of love, and it creates some problems. And the children, typically in blended families, can suffer, even if the children are older. I mean, even for gray divorces that are blending their families, sometimes there's tension, even among adult children of the two parties getting
Sure.
married, and then if one of the spouse passes away and then they leave all their money to the other, then the stepchildren want to sue, and then there's probate. I mean, there's a lot of layers, so it can be.
It's sticky.
That's why prenups are very, very encouraged and highly recommended. So.
Plus a good estate plan.
And a good estate plan, for
Think
sure.
of it, because under our laws, a widow or widower is entitled to half of any assets if there's a marriage. So you better have an estate plan and a good prenup if there's a second marriage to make
Right.
sure that you're protecting children from prior marriages.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
so these are issues. Let's go to another issue, and that is spousal support. We're assuming there's no child support because it's a gray divorce, unless someone has a child late in life. And,
Yeah.
But generally,
The octogenarian. We all remember that case from law school.
people in their 60s and 70s, they don't have young children, with a couple of exceptions I know of right now. But what happens to spousal support? We are guided so much, Sabrina, by formulas. I don't like formulas. It's like it's like a cheat sheet. It's an easy way to do things. Some judges will say, third of the marriage, third of the difference in salary. There are all kinds of things. We have the formulas that are used for spousal support, but they don't take into account certain things. They look at the income level, they look at the lifestyle, they look at the age, they look at education. They don't look at health.
No.
They don't look at fault. They don't look at certain key things. If someone has a disease, let's say someone is perfectly healthy when they get married, but during the second marriage someone suffers some very serious illness. Well, even in a short-term second marriage, the argument is it's got to be long-term spousal support. It might be lifetime.
Well, in a second marriage, if it's shorter term, then no. I mean, they're probably not going to get spousal support if it's a short-term marriage.
But if there's an illness, what if let's look at this example.
Okay.
Let's say it's a 7-year second marriage, and one spouse develops MS or some serious form of cancer. That person can never work again. What do you do with spousal support? You don't follow the formula. You can't.
You can't. Well, you have to be sure to get a very aggressive lawyer who can leverage and negotiate and, really fight hard and take it to trial. because a lot of times if you try to mediate or on your own or try to resolve it amongst the parties, you won't get long-term spousal support.
I mean, my attitude in a case like that, if it's a severe debilitating illness, it's got to be death or remarriage. So, and this is different. You've got to look at the facts of the situation.
Well, every case is different.
Right.
But, they use the guidelines. They use, as you know, with child support, you have the statutory guidelines.
Right.
And they often, when you're calculating spousal support, those are just guidelines. Right. And you were talking about fault. Well, again, if you have a good lawyer, you can leverage that fault to say, look, if your client isn't willing to come up and bring more to the table, then we're going to go to trial and expose A, B, or C of what your client did. And then, of course, it's relevant, right? So, and no judge would preclude you from bringing some of that evidence forward, I don't believe, in my estimation and my experience. I've been able to do that.
I agree with you.
So, and sometimes fault does come into play with property division, and sometimes, rarely, with spousal support. But it's the rule rather than the exception that it doesn't matter. We're in a no-fault state. Fault doesn't matter. Again, but some of these things, like you said, illnesses, whether they can work again or not, fault, whether they've had a million affairs, whatever, it doesn't, the law doesn't really care. So.
And these are the cases where you need an excellent attorney who's prepared to go to battle on these issues.
Yes.
Let's continue with spousal support. Let's say it's a 30-year marriage, and they're in their 60s. In a case like that, most judges are going to say death or remarriage. Some judges will say just death. If someone's in their mid to late 60s, it should be reviewable at the further order of the court. I mean, certain judges in Oakland County, if there was a trial, they would almost always order death. They wouldn't, or further order of the court, they wouldn't put remarriage in.
But see, that's a problem for that man, because eventually he's going to want to retire and his income will drop.
But that's a change in circumstances. So.
But a lot of times spousal support is non-modifiable. So the attorneys have to.
Well, that's what the attorneys are. I'm talking about if it goes to trial.
Okay.
A judge cannot make it non-modifiable.
No.
It has to be modifiable. It can be for a term of years, and it has to be reviewable. And some judges are going to say death or further order of the court. Others will say death or remarriage or the further order of the court. But the problem in this area, in a long-term marriage, is spousal support, death or remarriage isn't going to be long. If someone's in their mid-60s, they may be retiring in a year or two legitimately. Mm-hmm. So what do?
You have to go back to court.
So these are some of the issues that make it more complicated, because someone in their 60s or 70s, you're not going to have long-term spousal support, even though it should be. And perhaps in negotiating a settlement, you look into these things and maybe you do a buyout of spousal support, and maybe you shift property to take into account these things.
Mm-hmm. At the conclusion of the term of years, you shift the property. Yeah, for sure. I've seen long-term marriages that only had a 10-year spousal support provision, and it's unfortunate for that person who had to be staying at home to not have the income coming in after 10 years of a divorce.
And this is where it's so important to have someone who's really knowledgeable.
Yes.
I mean, you take a lot of care with every client, with every case, and because every situation is different. Mm-hmm. And too many attorneys take a cookie-cutter approach, and by doing that, they're not serving the client well.
I agree. That's why we care.
The other thing is Social Security is an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting, Sabrina, as a law is, you can't divide Social Security. You can look at it and say if someone's earning $2,000 a month Social Security and the other spouse, because they're now in their 60s or 70s, is getting $1,000 a month Social Security, you have to somehow balance it, perhaps through spousal support or through property division. We're down to 1 minute, believe it or not.
Wow.
Give us 3 takeaways before we sign off, Sabrina.
Well, just make sure you hire a really good attorney who knows how to deal with someone in their older years getting a divorce, who has seen all the different aspects, you know, like you say, of spousal support and, you know, trying to find a way to allow you to have a good life. You really want to have a good life. And just make sure this is really what you want to do. Make sure you want to have this transition. Make sure you know all the ramifications, really the pros and cons of a divorce. And finally, you know, you just want to just be happy, and whatever happens, you know that, you know, life will be okay. And whatever you're faced with, you know, just make sure you do it with grace and be kind.
Sabrina Cronin, the head of the Cronin Law Firm, I want to thank you so much for being my guest on Gracefully Graying, and I want to thank you for watching Gracefully Graying.
Thank you.